Dear students, good afternoon. I hope you are all well and I pray that you will remain well in this pandemic. However, I am Subhash Chandra Sarkar, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Government Rajendra College, Faridpur. Dear students, today I would like to welcome you to my online class on 20th century poetry, and this class is specially designed for honors fourth year students. Dear students, you know in your honors fourth year you have a subject or a course named 20th century poetry, and in this course you have four major modern poets, namely W.B. Yeats, then T.S. Eliot, Dylan Thomas, and finally Sylvia Plath. Well, dear students, today we will concentrate our discussion on Sylvia Plath, or you better say we will limit our discussion on Sylvia Plath. So, dear students, let us get ready for our today's discussion. You know, Sylvia Plath is usually considered one of the major female poets of the 20th century. She was born in 1932 and she died in 1963. She was mainly an American poet, novelist, and short story writer. She was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and then she studied at Smith College in Massachusetts in the United States of America, and then at Newnham College in Cambridge in UK or United Kingdom. She married fellow poet Ted Hughes in 1956, and they lived together in the United States and then in England. They had two children before being separated in 1962. She she had a problematic life following a long struggle with depression and a marital separation. Sylvia Plath committed suicide in 1963 when she was only 30 years old. However, controversy continues to surround the events of her life and death, as well as her writing and legacy. So, in this portion, we have a short introduction about Sylvia Plath. Well, now let us go a bit deeper. Sylvia Plath is accredited, or you better say credited, with advancing the genre of confessional poetry. You know, confessional poetry is a type of poetry originated in the United States of America in 1950s and in 1960s, and usually the poet Robert Lowell is a dominant figure in the genre of confessional poetry. This type of poetry is usually subjective, reflective, and definitely Sylvia Plath's poetry is usually considered confessional poetry. And she is best known for two of her published collection of poetry, namely The Colossus and Other Poems, and then Ariel, as well as she had a novel, you better say a semi-autobiographical novel named The Bell Jar, published shortly before her death. However, Sylvia Plath was awarded a posthumous Pulitzer Prize in Poetry in 1982, making her the first to receive this honor posthumously. So, these, you better say, the portion that you find in Sylvia Plath's introductory portion. Okay, now let us go to the major works of Sylvia Plath. So, if you consider the major works of Sylvia Plath, then you will find that her works are mainly divided into three major categories. The first one is poetry collection, then collected prose and novels, and finally children books. So we will better skip this portion. Just let us have a look. So the first published collection of Sylvia Plath's poetry is The Colossus and Other Poems. It was published in 1960. Then came the most significant collection of Sylvia Plath, that is Ariel, published in 1965. And then you will get Crossing the Water in 1971 and Winter Trees in 1971, and finally two collections, namely Collected Poems and Selected Poems, were published respectively in 1981 and in 1985. So you will find that Sylvia Plath is predominantly or mainly a poet. Anyway, she had a semi autobiographical novel named The Belger. It was published in 1963. This novel was published under the pseudonym Victoria Lucas, and it reappeared in 1966 once again after or under her own name. Then she had a collection named Letters Home, Correspondence from 1950 to 1963, published in 1975. So these are the major prose or novels written by Sylvia Plath. And interestingly, you find that Sylvia Plath had a collection for children's book. The bedroom, or you better say, it doesn't matter suit, or collected children's stories. So these are minor works actually. So Sylvia Plath's major works are definitely the Colossus and Other Poems and Ariel and the novel The Bell Jar. So, dear students, you know, in your honors fourth year, you need to read four poems from Sylvia Plath. The first one is Morning Song, then Words, then comes the rival, and finally crossing the water. So, if you consider the major poems of Sylvia Plath, then you will get that her major poems include Daddy, Ariel, and Lady Lazarus. None of these major poems are included in your syllabus. So let us forget what that is. So let us better concentrate on the poems that are included in our honors fourth year syllabus. So if you look at the screen, then you will find the first poem for our honors fourth year syllabus is Morning Song. So dear students, you know Morning Song was the poem published in the collection named Ariel, and it was published in 1965. So the poem, you just, if you technically consider the poem, then you will find six stanzas, one, two, three, four, five, six stanzas, and each stanza consists of three lines. The poet follows the free verse technique in her entire poem with no set rhyme scheme or meter. So you better can call it a type of modern poem. Well, so if we just read the first stanza, just let us read the first stanza. Love set you going like a fat gold watch. The midwife slapped your foot soles, and your belt cry took its place among the elements. So, the first word of the poem is love. And what did Sylvia Plath say in this poem? Love set you. You means the firstborn child of Sylvia Plath, her first child Frida, her daughter. So you is her child, or you better say her daughter. So if you consider the poem in thematic structure, then you can call the poem is about the narration of the birth of Sylvia Plath's child, and the speaker of the poem is definitely is Sylvia Plath, the mother. Well, so the child is a precious gift born out of love, like fat gold watch. So just concentrate on the simile, a fat gold watch. This simile is not natural. You better call it a surreal simile, or in this simile, our poet Sylvia Plath used surreal image that is anti-realistic or something that is not usually we find in other poets or in the reference of other poets. Anyway, so as she means our poet Sylvia Plath, she steps into the new world out of mother's womb. The midwife helps to confirm life in the newborn by tapping the little feet. So in this poem, the we have already referred or we have already mentioned that the poem Morning Song is about the birth of the child, and here Sylvia Plath continues to explore her feelings and her ideas about mothering or motherhood. So from the first word onward, we recognize the great affection and tenderness the mother feels for her child. In this poem, we will find that Sylvia Plath is a bit protective, waking to listen for the baby's cries, to which she responds immediately. But this sort of picture will get change when the poem advances, and we will find that it is not that Sylvia Plath feels alienated from the infant, rather, she senses the child's individuality. She knows that it is not simply an extension of herself, rather, the child is an individual self. So, the simile in the last line closes the poem. Just let us read the last stanza. And now you try your hand full of notes, the clear vowels rise like balloons. So there is another simile, and this simile closes the poem, returning to the positivity of the opening word. The child is growing already, making progress as she acquires language, and the final simile catches the wonder of this development exactly. And so, what we find in the poem Morning Song, in fact, Sylvia Plath captures the reflective joy of a new mother in this poem, Morning Song. Well, now let us go to the next poem. The next poem is Words, and this poem was published in 1963. So, in this poem, you will find four stanzas one, two, three, four, and the poem is not conventional, rather, it is unconventional. And definitely, the poem Words is about the act of writing, or you better say, the act of writing poetry. The poem is composed entirely of metaphors and the image. Sylvia Plath incorporated are horses, the mirror, then stars, excess, etc. The poem's metaphoric landscape is mental rather than physical. So definitely the art of writing is not a matter of physicality, rather it is a matter of mentality, or better you can say the art of writing is a mental work. So there is no hand on the eggs that strike, no rider on the horses, no eyes behind the welling tears. So the poet is dissatisfied with the work she has produced, but still she recognizes that while she will die, her words, that means her poetry, will survive. So the poem, the words, is actually about the art of writing or the act of writing. Well, so now if we go to the next poem, then the next poem is the rival. So you know the meaning of the word rival. Rival is someone who is a competitor. So in this poem, you will find the personal reflection of Sylvia Plath's life. So the rival in the poem The Rival may be Asia Weevil, the mistress of Ted Hughes, who was pregnant with his child at the time of Sylvia Plath's suicide, or it may refer to Sylvia Plath's mother, or to the relationship between some friends of hers who were having material difficulties. More likely, it is a combination of these things. So, the poem, the central image of the poem, The Rival, is the moon, and here the moon is one who is annihilating. Definitely, she is not natural. She is something that is destructive. So, if you consider rivalry in love, then the rival is definitely annihilating, and the image that you find is represented in the poem is the moon. So, the very first line, if the moon smile, she would resemble you. You leave the same impression of something beautiful but annihilating. So, the poem is very famous in the whole or entire selection of Sylvia Plath's poetry, and this poem has a personal touch. So you better read the whole poem. Okay, the next poem, you know, Crossing the Water. So the poem Crossing the Water is a poem in the collection Crossing the Water, which was published in 1971 after the death of Sylvia Plath. So in this poem, the poet is going to narrate about a transition from one point of life to another point of life. The poem shows that two people, definitely the two people are imaginary, or you better call the two people a couple. One may be Sylvia Plath, and another one is someone special for her. So the poem shows that the two people are carried across the water in a boat, and the couple are being transported to death. So crossing the water. So the crossing the water is a symbolical, or you better can call it a metaphorical poem. And in this poem, the transition from life to death is reflected, and Sylvia Plath shows the couple are being transported to death. And the very last line of the poem, this is the silence of astounded souls. So the silence at the end of the poem suggests finality, and Plath has employed image that suggest that life is coming to a close. So dear students, these are the four poems that are selected for your honors fourth year syllabus. So I better suggest you to read the poems carefully and sincerely. Then you will get the meaning of the poems, and definitely you will get a good idea about the poet Sylvia Plath. Okay, now let us go to the major themes in the poetry of Sylvia Plath. So, Sylvia Plath's poetry deal with different types of themes. The major themes that we find in Sylvia Plath's poetry are motherhood, then male-female relationship, then life and death, and finally the identity of the self. We have already mentioned Sylvia Plath is a modern poet, and her poetry is credited with the genre of confessional poetry. So she is not conventional, and her treatment of her themes in her poetry is definitely something unconventional. So the first theme in Sylvia Plath's poetry is definitely mothering or motherhood. A good number of poems in Sylvia Plath's poetry deal with mothering. Mothering is a, you better can call it a major theme in Sylvia Plath's poetry. We have already read the poem Morning Song, and in this poem we just try to observe that in Morning Song, Sylvia Plath suggests that babies has unique individual personalities. The baby is never simply an extension of the mother in her poetry. That means the baby is an individual self or individual identity. And Sylvia Plath observed babies closely, showing us the wonder of new life through her use of unusual and unexpected metaphor and similes to describe infants. But we should remember one thing: Sylvia Plath is not sentimental about the theme of motherhood or mothering. Well, the next theme in Sylvia Plath's poetry is male female relationship. Actually, there are two key male female relationships in Sylvia Plath's poetry: those between fathers and daughters, and between husbands and wives. Neither relationship brings the female speaker in her poetry much pleasure. That means the male female relationship that may be either between fathers and daughters or between husbands and wives are some kind of problematic or complicated relationship in Sylvia Plath's poetry. Well, another theme in Sylvia Plath's poetry is life and death. You know, Sylvia Plath committed suicide at the age of 30. So, death is very fertile in the poetry of Sylvia Plath. So, you can call death or life a fertile subject for Sylvia Plath, and many critics have suggested that Sylvia Plath was driven by a death wish, that her morbid poetry lead her directly to suicide. So this theme is very complicated in the poetry of Sylvia Plath. And the final theme in Sylvia Plath's poetry is the self or the identity of the self, or you better say the divided or dual self. So Sylvia Plath's exploration of the self is complicated, and we find that this theory has been used to explain the presence of simultaneously vengeful and masochistic female speaker in Sylvia Plath's poetry. So the identity of self or the dual identity is very complicated in Sylvia Plath's poetry. Sylvia Plath explored the relationship between the self and the environment on many occasions in her poetry. So, dear students, today in our discussion on 20th century poetry and particularly on Sylvia Plath, we have tried to give an impression about the biography or the background information about Sylvia Plath, then the major works of Sylvia Plath, then the four poems that are included in your honors fourth year syllabus. And for our time constraint, we cannot elaborate, but we try to have an idea about the points that are included in our syllabus. And finally, we try to give you an idea about the major themes in Sylvia Plath's poetry. So, dear students, I once again would like to request you to read the poem from the text. I think reading the poem is very important to understand the meaning of the poetry. No paraphrase will give you any complete idea about the points that you would like to comprehend. So I once again request you to read the poem, and then you will definitely get a good idea about Sylvia Plath. And Sylvia Plath is more or less important for our 20th century poetry. So, dear students, that's all for today. I would like to convey my thanks to you for your patient listening. So, I would like to thank you, and once again, I would like to thank you, and I pray to God that you may remain safe. So, thank you, everyone.